Good evening. Welcome to Economics 330, Global Trade and Political Economy. This is our City University of New York, Medgar Evers College, Professor Felix Obi. Today is Tuesday, September 24th, 2024, and we're now past the 5-minute grace period, and we will now commence the formal part of today's lecture. First, let me begin with some housekeeping and important information. So, in lieu of a midterm exam, there will be a term paper that will be made available next week, Monday, 12:01 a.m. Monday next week. And you would have a 2-week period. And I know that you have some days off, no school days in between the 2-week period beginning from Monday next week. You would have that 2-week period to complete the term paper. I will be posting, of course, by Sunday night, I will be posting instructions on the term paper. And the portal obviously would also be open. And as we have office hour on Tuesday, feel free to come up with questions and any questions or thoughts that you might think might be of value. I am really rooting for everyone, and I'm pretty confident that the class will do well. With that said, let us get into today's lecture. During this module, we will begin a 3-part study of the 3 theoretical perspectives of global trade. These include the liberal perspective, the realistic perspective, and the historical materialism perspective. Again, it's a 3-part series. Each week we will cover one of these 3 parts. Of course, as I mentioned in my preamble, there would be a 2-week gap where we're going from next week, where we're going to tackle our term paper. And then we will go back by the 3rd week into realistic perspective. So this week we will begin with the liberal perspective. And here's a definition, a working definition of the liberal perspective. The liberal perspective is not without distinctions. For instance, liberal economists emphasize the importance of free market and private property and seek to limit the government's role in economic affairs. Laissez-faire, which is leave well alone. Of note, liberalism is the most influential perspective in international political economy. Although some liberal economists favor as little government involvement in commerce as possible, others believe that some government intervention is necessary for the effective functioning of markets. And this is really an interesting conversation to have, especially today. I was listening to business news, and there was conversations about about levels of regulation for digital assets. And the gentleman who was on the radio was of the opinion that because of sufficient regulation in the US market creates investor confidence, and that confidence is growing the digital instruments as an investment tool. But of course, others, as we will soon learn, would also argue, well, what's sufficient regulation? And too much regulation can begin to stifle innovation. And that's really the tension. Simply put, liberal internationalism is a foreign policy doctrine that supports international institutions, open markets, cooperative security, and liberal democracy. So these are the basic foundations of a liberal internationalism. It's the policy doctrine that supports international institutions, and we've gone through some of this. World Bank Group, the IMF, the United Nations, among others. So, and as we go into the weeks ahead, we will get into international institutions and regional institutions, but that's a conversation for another day. So, open markets. Open markets means, again, working with the World Trade Organization, having a rational, clearly stated rules for trade engagement with minimal barriers to entry, cooperative security, and liberal democracy. Notably, the three types of liberal theory of international political economy includes orthodox, belief in negative freedom. That is, the market should be given complete freedom to function. On the contrary, the interventionalists and institutional liberals do not believe in negative freedom. They take the view that markets should not be given complete freedom. Note, laissez-faire. Again, this is one of those words and or phrases that I tell you to make a notation of or take note of and use them as you communicate in your daily interactions, especially in professional engagement. They have very good signaling effect. So laissez-faire is a doctrine that opposes governmental interference in economic affairs beyond the minimum necessary for the maintenance of peace and prosperity. So again, the question is, what is the minimum? And that is really a point of tension. But again, that's a detailed conversation for another class. The number two is interventionist liberals. They believe that strong international institutions like the IMF, the World Trade Organization, IMF, of course, is the International Monetary Fund. They believe that strong international institutions like the IMF, the World Trade Organization, and the World Bank should interfere in the functioning of markets so that equality and justice can be ensured. Then the third, of course, are institutional liberalism.
It's not working.
They believe that government involvement should be there in the functions of markets to ensure equality and justice. By understanding these three different perspectives, we are able to appreciate the sources of conflict within and among nations regarding trade policies. Furthermore, liberalism revolves around three interrelated principles. The first principle is a rejection of power politics as the only possible outcome of international relations. It questions security warfare principles of realism. Two, mutual benefit and international cooperation is the third interrelated principle. The third interrelated principle is the role of international organizations and non-governmental actors in shaping state preferences and policy choices. The liberal perspective emphasizes three factors that encourage more cooperation and less conflict among states. The first is international institutions such as the United Nations, which provide a forum to resolve disputes in nonviolent ways. As some of you may know, this week is actually the United Nations General Assembly, which is when world leaders gather in New York and they work on developing consensus on global challenges, transnational challenges that are beyond the scope of nation states or even regional bodies to address. Quite often, those are the issues they focus on. And I'm thinking climate change especially.
Yeah.
And of course, wars and things like that. Number two is international trade. Now, because when countries, economies are interconnected through trade, they are less likely to go to war with each other. So you got to understand the organizing theory behind the idea that when countries and economies are interconnected through trade, they are less likely to go to war. This is not a full-blown, foolproof policy, or at least theory, and I'll get to that in a second. But the idea is because of a theory called MAD, M-A-D, mutually assured destruction. So if we trade and we have our economies are closely integrated, if I go to war with you, I would lose because all the stuff that I bought that I will buy from you, you will no longer have the capacity to make them, quite likely, because you're at war with me. Conversely, all the stuff that I would have been selling to consumers in your country, I am going to be unable to sell them because your consumers are, the other country's economy is going to be on a war footing. So nobody wins that war. You could recognize that the economy of the United States and Canada is very closely integrated. I mean, there are other cultural reasons too, and legacy reasons. But because we are so we have such close trade relations, we are unlikely, we being the United States, is unlikely to get into conflict with Canada because it will be mutually assured destruction. None of us will come out looking good. Now, I also said that there is this theory is not foolproof. And one quick example of that was the government of Germany's trade philosophy with Russia. Germany in particular, and the European Union much largely, believed that if they integrated their energy needs and tied it closely with Russia's export needs. Russia, as you may know, is a big hydrocarbon exporter. And for a time, Russia was the largest, overwhelmingly largest supplier of natural gas to Germany and most of the European Union. And the theory, according to the Germans, was something as follows. Russia would be unlikely to go to war with anyone that may destabilize the economies of the European Union, because doing so would harm the revenue Russia derives from selling gas to European Union. The problem is Russia also saw this European Union's market dependency on Russian gas as leverage. That's the flip side to it. It appears that Russia calculated that European Union will be less likely to put pressure on it if we were to act in manners that is not consistent with international order, simply because the Europeans will simply freeze to death. They will disrupt natural gas supply to Germany and most other European countries. It will impact their ability to generate energy. It would have which will have a negative impact on industry, on productivity, not to mention simply heating homes and cooking meals. So Russia thought that was leverage. Some have argued or opined that that was part of Russia's calculation in going into Ukraine because it thought that the European Union would not want to act, would not have the luxury of acting forcefully against its incursion into Ukraine territory. Obviously, both calculations were wrong. But again, I just mentioned that not to go into a tangent, but I just mentioned that to show that it is the theory is not foolproof. I also say that as part of my strong philosophy in dialectical thinking. Dialectical thinking, again, is one of those things that you want to take note of, is an idea that you never fully understand an issue until you see it from all sides. So the third is the spread of democracy, as well as established democracies rarely go to war with one another. As such, the logic is that if there are more democracies, interstate war will be less frequent. So And the reason democracies rarely go to war is because public sentiment matters to the survival of the government. Economic imbalances that could occur, governments are sensitive to economic imbalances that could occur should they go to war, and how that may create economic dislocations for citizens. So both democracies are incentivized to look for peaceful negotiation and settlement. The other is that true democracies typically have strong institutions, which could also act as a check on the excesses of politicians sometimes. So liberals believe that international institutions play a key role in cooperation among states via interdependence. So again, as demonstrated by this ongoing United Nations General Assembly, the interdependence between countries in forging a common consensus on transnational challenges deepens cooperation and reduces the likelihood of rancor. Of note, there are three main components of interdependencies. These include economic, financial, and cultural needs. Significantly, in the liberal perspective, security tends to not be the primary goal in state-to-state interactions, and military forces are not typically used, which would now show you say, for instance, when the United States wants to influence an outcome, it is not uncommon to see the United States Secretary of State go engage rather than the United States Secretary of Defense. So in the liberal perspective is that that military goal is not the primary objective in state-to-state interactions. And the larger goal is mutual prosperity. And oftentimes that requires diplomacy. Rather, liberalism argues that international diplomacy can be a very effective way to get states to interact with each other honestly and support nonviolent solutions to problems. Many of us have noted with curiosity the challenges that is ongoing in the Middle East and with the shadow diplomacy that Secretary Blinken has been engaged in. You don't often see Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin making those trips because we believe that as a liberal democracy, the belief is that, the United States belief is that diplomatic solutions will be more likely, is the most sustainable strategy. Liberalism takes the view that states can work together to maximize prosperity and minimize conflict. Lastly, let me quickly touch on the phrase you most likely have come across, and especially within the last week, the Washington Consensus. This is one of those phrases, again, that you might want to take a note of. The Washington Consensus is a set of macroeconomic policies widely supported by leaders of intergovernmental organizations, multinational corporations, donor states, and economists. It includes fiscal discipline, maintaining reasonable balanced budgets, public spending focused at economic return, education, healthcare, and infrastructure, rather than defense spending or subsidy. Low taxes. 4, money supply controlled by professionals, not by politicians. 5, exchange rates driven by markets, rather than some manipulation in the back room. But again, depending on a country's level of development, exchange rates that is 100% driven by markets may not be the most appropriate and monetary policy. But again, different conversation for a different class. Different conversation, and that's a debate that could be had. There are no absolutes. Number 6, open markets to trade and investments. 7, deregulate economy, and privatize national industries. Again, it is not, these are general principles. And number 8, protection of property rights. This is really critical. So with this 8 set of macroeconomic policies that is known as the Washington Consensus, we're going to wrap up today's, the formal section of this week's lecture. Again, as I mentioned, next week, we would have, for the next 2 weeks, with a few no-class days in between. I'm sure you've been looking at your calendars and getting excited about those days. We would have our term paper. And I'm glad to follow up on that conversation, right after this formal section of the class. And with that, I'm going to turn off the recording and take questions as accordingly.